I think we have a quorum, and this is a working session that we've set up for on today's date, primarily to hear from the folks from the Board of Elections about some of their processes and how those impact timelines and considerations for filing deadlines, et cetera, as that would impact any action that we might take to establish changes concerning succession for a vacancy of the county executive or county council seats. So we have a guest on today's date. I want to get right to it, but initially, let me ask Janae to call a roll.
For the May 23rd meeting of the Charter Review Commission, Judge Adrian.
Here.
Diane Downing. The Honorable Susan Drucker.
Here.
Dennis Kennedy.
Here.
Michael King. Here. The Honorable Tom Persiak. Claire Rizzaco. Here. Victor Ruiz. Here. And Davita Russell.
Okay, thank you. We have minutes from the last meeting. Good enough. Moving right along there. As I indicated, we have representatives from the Board of Elections present. You want to call them forward?
We have Tony from the Board of Elections.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Council.
My name is Tony Perlotti. I'm the Deputy Director at the Board of Elections. And I am here today because of the topic of charter amendment for replacing vacancies in county executive. My staff had reviewed, I think, some potential draft language and had some concerns on it, and then went ahead and met with me to discuss that. I think they also had a meeting with Mr. King. And so what I am here to do today, I guess, is to answer questions, or I guess start by telling you maybe some initial concerns that we have with the draft, so you kind of know where we're coming from. As we understand, it looks like some of the proposed changes call for, when there's a vacancy in the office of county executive, that a special general election would be scheduled. I think it was 90 to 180 days after that vacancy, and 4 weeks prior to that general election, there would be a special primary election. So that time frame can be a little bit tough, but the language itself also doesn't talk about filing deadlines. So if there's going to be a primary election, as opposed to the political parties naming an appointee to run in a general election, then you have to figure in that time frame for people filing petitions, us reviewing them, and setting those things. But regardless of that there, just the time frame itself of a special primary being 4 weeks before a general, we can't pull that off. We need at least 60 days in between those two elections to make that happen. So when people go and they vote on election day, those are the unofficial results. And then boards of elections have 11 to 21 days to certify those results. For the 10 days after election, we're not allowed to touch ballots. And when we certify the election, that's by having a board meeting and getting those things addressed. So at a minimum, if everything went as well as it could, potentially on the 11th day, we could have a board meeting and certify those election results. So that's already cutting into that window. If by chance there is a election result that would require an automatic recount, or if someone wanted to request a recount, there's a 5-day, after the election is certified, then there's a 5-day window in which people can either apply for a recount, or we have to wait that time period to conduct an automatic recount, and that's where, if the results are within 0.5 of 1% of each other, that generates the automatic recount. So that means then, on an automatic, we could start that 5 days after. If it was a requested recount, the 5-day period happens, and then we have to allow an additional 5 days then to notify the other party who didn't request a recount but who's subject to the recount, that's gonna happen. So now we're talking, even if we were fast-tracked it, you're at 21 days. If you took longer than the 11 days to certify, and you took the full 21, we haven't even haven't finalized it, and we're supposed to conduct the election. So that timeframe's tough. If it's 60 days in between, it's still tight, but we can make that happen for a special to primary. We have a contract with a moving vendor, so all the voting equipment that you use on election day, it takes approximately 10 to 14 days for them to deliver that to the polling location, about another 10 days for them to pick it up afterwards. So just the pickup from the primary and then the amount of time for them to deliver it for the general, again, there's not enough time to do that. We haven't even tested the equipment for logic and accuracy and all those things. So I think you get the point on that piece, that's a little bit tight. So if this were to go forward, we would appreciate or ask that window be at least 60 days in between the primary and the general. So, but then going to the primary election, again, there's nothing here that talks about filing deadlines or any of those types of things. And so with the current proposed language, if you're on the short end and having that be 90 days, we really like to have about 90 days before a primary election to actually get that election set up. You have the petition process, we get those, we have to certify those, have a board meeting to do that. We have to have ballots ready to be disseminated 45 days before an election, because that's when your uniformed overseas voters are eligible to get a ballot. And then early voting starts the day after the close of registration. Close of registration is 30 days out. That's a Sunday, rolls to a Monday, so early voting usually starts on Tuesday, about 28 days. So we need to have everything in line for that to happen. And so we really, what works well for us is having 90 days. The current, when you, not in a special, but just when you run for county executive, that filing deadline is 90 days before the primary. So that's what happened for this past May 8th. That's when they had to have it. So we would like to have that too. So basically, about 150 days is what we like to see happen in order to execute a primary and a general. So if a vacancy occurred, if a general election were to happen 150 days or 150 to 180 or whatever that would be, and then if there was a 60-day window in between the general and the primary, we can make that happen. So that is for that. But there isn't the need to have a primary if you didn't want to have a primary. There is the ability for the political parties to appoint a candidate to a general election. So that's just an option for you to consider. One of the things that I would ask that you take into consideration, I guess, is cost. So if you're having a special or a general election and it doesn't match up with the current general election, it's $2 million per election for a countywide election. So if the primary didn't fall on the November general, that'd be $2 million, and then if the corresponding general election didn't fall, that'd be another $2 million. So it'd be $4 million to hold both those elections. If you're able to have one of those elections or a general election with the parties appointing, and that falls on the general election in November, then it costs the county about $700,000. And the reason is because the more jurisdictions that are on the ballot, those costs are shared amongst all the jurisdictions, and so it brings that cost down. When you're the only person on the ballot or jurisdiction, then your cost is definitely a lot more. So if that route were to be taken, as far as parties appointing, we would hope that you would look to see if somebody resigned, again, within about 90 days. 86 days, I think the code talks about, that's what happens currently. So for processes where parties appoint. So those are some of the time frames that we have concerns with. I guess with that, really what questions are there, and then maybe that that's kind of like just a general overview.
Well, let me just ask you for one other layer on top of this. In addition to the county executive, we were also looking at the possibility of making some modifications with regard to vacancies for seats on council, which is a little bit less, but, you know, does what you just laid out still kind of kick in as considerations?
I didn't look at that very closely, but what my staff told me was that the language is actually different for the two offices.
Right.
If a vacancy occurs on or before the filing deadline for the primary of a countywide general election, your appointment shall serve. So it looks like the county council is putting that election at the general election in November, which is a good thing. And that's actually how the current county executive language reads. It puts it to that general election. So that's good for cost purposes, and there's not a timeliness issue because we know every November we're having a countywide election. And it sets the filing, so on or before the filing deadline for the primary for countywide. So again, there's no language about filing petitions for that, but the language for county council does say if the vacancy occurs on or before the filing deadline for the primary for the countywide general election during the second year of a four-year term, that would allow the sufficient, because that vacancy is happening before the filing deadline for the primary, there could be time then for petitions to happen in those things. The only thing is, if the person, say, if the county council member were to resign the day before the filing deadline, and you have to, 50 signatures is not a lot of signatures to gather, but if you have one day to do it, then that can be difficult. So I would say to that language, the honor before the deadline for the primary, they should probably be like 10 days before the filing deadline for the primary, which then gives actual candidates appropriate time to appoint. If someone isn't able to make that, then would probably, I would think, default into the party process where they put forth the candidates to be on the ballot.
Mr. Chair, just to that point, and I'm only addressing this, and thank you, Mr. Pilati, for coming in. I think this is really helpful, and I think the conversation I had with both Brent and Corey was very illuminating. Just to the point you just made about if the vacancy occurred the day before the filing deadline, we actually had something like that occur back in, I think, 2014. And in that instance, I believe there's some window of time before the filing deadline. I want to say it's like maybe 20 or 25 days, where if the vacancy occurs within that window, then the Board of Elections won't accept nominating petitions. It's simply the party gets to appoint the nominee. And I think the concept behind that was that and this is in the revised code, was that if a vacancy occurs in that short time frame, you're right, it is very difficult to gather petitions. And if you had some maneuvering by people who wanted to announce they were leaving the day of the filing deadline and had their person file and nobody else had any time, that would be unfair in terms of the process. So I think that's the rationale behind why that's set up in state law. But I just want to make sure that actually happened. And so I believe the revised code addresses that to a certain degree.
I think when the language is silent, and that it will refer back to that. And I do remember that.
Yeah.
Because there was, when was it going to be? I think it was Julian.
Yes, Julian Rogers. Yep.
When. So. So I think, yeah, things could revert back to that. I just don't know what those code sections are, because it's different rules for municipalities and state offices and all that, and county offices, so.
There are pluses and minuses, I guess, for everything that could be considered, and there certainly are a lot of reasons for us to consider, making modifications in the current language. I guess I would want to ask you, as it relates to the current language, whether or not that was vetted with the Board of Elections before it was put in place.
Not to my recollection. I don't recall that.
If you've had an opportunity, and again, I know we called you over here at the last minute, and I want to, reiterate what Michael just said about, how grateful we are that you were able to make some time to come and sit with us. And I know that you may not have had the opportunity to give any real thought to this, but do you have a feeling about the current language as it relates to whether it meets your guidelines?
Not the draft, but what's actually in.
What's currently on the books?
What's currently on the books is, I think it's pretty good. I think it points to the general election in November, which for cost purposes is good, that it points to that. It doesn't carve out having elections at other times, kind of based on when the vacancy happens. So we're always appreciative when we can
Have some wiggle room.
yeah, and have those, and you have that big election, and you're already preparing, you're sending everything out to the county, all the equipment and everything, so it just becomes administratively easier to do that than trying to figure out a date that would work both for us administratively and for the voters, and not cause voter confusion too. Like, okay, what's this election now? So I think the current language was pretty good. There's a different succession where the current language talks about president of council versus chief of staff. We really don't have a preference on that, other than just I guess a comment is that I think the requirements for the county executive is they have to be a registered elector of the county, and the chief of staff, they probably all have been that, but I don't necessarily know if that's required of them. So that's for, I don't know if that comes into play when you're signing off on documents or whatever it is, if you're not a registered, if the executive isn't a registered elector of the county. But, I mean, that's not a Board of Elections thing, that's for you guys internally. And I think what it also did is it dealt with the vacancy happening in the first and second year. And with that, made it so if it did happen on that front half, you could have your election and have the person fill it, versus the proposed going into like October of the third year. That can be difficult, because then you go in, so in the fourth year is when you're electing for that next term, and with this current language, that could have, with the 90 to 180 days, so if you resign at the end of September, then 6 months is October, November, December, January, February, March. So you're having your general in March, but then in that May, you're having the primary for that same office for the following year. So that can definitely be a little bit confusing, where this here, the current language prevents that from happening. I mean, I think even if something happened, if the vacancy happened in the third year, but if it happened prior to the primary for the third year, then that you would go ahead and you would have if you had a primary, say in May, and then your general in November, that person would actually serve out that full last fourth year, and I think it would be less confusion. So I would just say that I think it's a little less the current language is a little bit less confusing for voters when you start getting towards what happens at the end of that third year for voters. I think as far as cost, it ties it to the November general, so that, that's good for taxpayers for that. And it definitely, I think, gives us some timelines that we can definitely work with as far as administratively equipment and having all those types of things ready.
Yeah, I think our challenge really is to figure out and to anticipate the unintended consequences of any change. And so we want to make sure that in trying to do good, that we don't, screw it up for you. Okay, and certainly don't want to screw it up for the rest of the voting public, if at all possible. And by the same token, we're looking to, the whole purpose of doing a charter review is to see where you can make meaningful improvement on the current process. So, again, I want to thank you. I want to open it up to the rest of the members of the commission to see if anybody has any other questions that they'd like to pose to you. Oh, no? Everybody's good? Okay.
I guess I would just say one last thing is with your revision, it does allow for a replacement to be elected sooner than what the current language does. But again, you just have to be careful with those dates to give us ample time to actually execute the election.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that you just said just a minute ago is one of those unintended consequences that hadn't really crossed my mind. And if we have to expand it in order to give you enough time to be able to meet all of the filing deadlines and everything else that's necessary in order to get this done in a timely fashion, that once that's done, it just may kick things into into the next year or right up against another election, and that certainly is problematic. Okay.
Well, so I appreciate the time and the opportunity to.
And we got you out of here in a half an hour.
There you go. Great. Well, thank you. And any follow-up questions? Just go ahead. Don't feel free to email, call, whatever, and we'll get you some whatever information that you need. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so we kind of have been going back and forth about a proposal as it relates to succession for both the executive and council. And, I've had an opportunity to kind of talk to each one of you just to kind of see what your impressions were, which is why I wanted to have this discussion. And so I guess I want to ask at this point whether or not anybody has any input that they want to make. Yes.
I guess just after all the discussion, to me, there doesn't seem to be reason enough to change the current language as it stands today. And that includes keeping it that the council president would be the one succeeding should the county executive win the lottery tomorrow, then Dan Brady's executive. So I just don't see a reason why, I think we've had a great healthy discussion about it, but I just don't see anything saying this is why you need to change what's already in the charter.
Anybody else? Mike?
I would agree with Mayor Drucker on that. I mean, I think there are. I wish that there would be a better way to conceptualize this, because I do think there is room for improvement in the current language. The challenge is there's no perfect solution, and as you said, I mean, I think avoiding unintended consequences is really the name of the game here. And if whatever we recommended had any significant unintended consequences, I feel confident that it would not be an improvement on the current language. So if this is something that can be improved, perhaps it's something that, council or a future charter review commission could revisit at a certain point. But I think this is probably, given our time frame, not something that seems realistic to fully vet in the next month or so.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. In that being the case, I think it might be appropriate for me to entertain a motion as it relates to the proposal. Is there a motion?
What's moving? I mean, maybe just put in the positive to maintain the current charter language and not recommend any change, not recommend amendments to council?
Yeah.
That's a good motion. All right.
Or vice versa. I think that Susan will let that be your motion. Michael, you're gonna second? Okay. It's been properly moved and seconded. Is there any further unreadiness on the motion? Any unreadiness on the motion? Any unreadiness on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries, and that will draft consistent with what Susan's motion was. The second item up for discussion today is as it relates to campaign finance. And again, we've had a lot of information. We've had one proposal, it was superseded by a second proposal. You've had an opportunity to discuss it. Again, I've talked to each of you individually to see what your thoughts were. My sense of it is that there is a pretty broad understanding on the part of the commission that campaign finance is an important issue that needs to be recognized, and that one of the ways to recognize it would be to note it in the charter. But that there is also a lot of angst as it relates to how much information should be in the charter about where that goes. And so I know that I talked to actually each of you, I think, about the fact that we were pretty much uniformly of mind that we wanted to put forward some language that supports campaign finance regulation, but we really wanted to leave all of the details of that to be handled basically by county council where we think it's most appropriate. And if that is the sense of the body, then I would like to entertain a motion to that effect, if there is one forthcoming.
I would move that.
Okay. Utilizing the language that I've just put forward as the motion. Is there a second? Properly moved and seconded, and just to restate the motion would be to the effect that it will be the recommendation of the Charter Review Commission that language be placed into the county charter, recognizing the importance of campaign finance regulation and requesting that regulation as appropriate be brought forward by county council by way of ordinance to implement that importance. And again, we'll draft the specific language. Be somewhat along the lines of much of what was contained in Mr. Tarter's recommendation. Okay. So, that being the case, is there any unreadiness on the motion? Any unreadiness on the motion?
Mr. Chair, just to clarify to the last point you made, we're not voting necessarily on this specific language. We're voting in concept to move forward with something akin to this, and that will work out that language. Is that
That's
a fair
correct.
statement? Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any further unreadiness on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. We're open for further discussion. Okay. Hearing none, we're at point of public input.
We have public input from Will Tarter.
Hi, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Wanted to just say two quick things. The first one is to thank the commission for the work that you've done, as well as the vote you just took on the topic of campaign finance. As you all are aware, a lot of work has gone into that, and I appreciate this commission understanding the importance of that topic. One of the things I wanted to touch on was about the succession conversation. One of the things that was discussed during the Board of Elections representative, he was talking about the ability for political parties to appoint a person to a general election. And while I apologize, I had to step out, but I would want to share my hesitancy to that because one of the things that we've talked about in this particular charter is the role that political parties play in appointing individuals to seats versus the electorate having the ability to vote on who they want to see in the seats. And so that's one of the things that, as not just this charter commission, but in future commissions or future conversations around succession planning, to really take inventory of accessibility to the ballot for individuals who might not necessarily be members of that political party. So I wanted to just kind of put that out there. I do hope that council will take on this issue sometime between now and the next charter review commission, because although this isn't an issue right now, I think that it could be an issue at some point in the future. And I would hate for something to happen where there is any ambiguity about what language is currently in the charter. So again, I want to note the work that has been done and say thank you to all of you for this opportunity. I look forward to being in conversations on what that language looks like moving forward. And I think a lot of work has been done on a lot of fronts, and I look forward to continuing that after this meeting is done. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll have that conversation. I want to make sure that we put together something that effectuates what we just said and what we just did. And so we'll have that conversation and pass it back and forth between the members of the commission, make sure we get it honed down to what everybody is, believes that what they thought they heard is actually what they heard.
All right. Thank you very much to members of the commission. It's been a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have comment from Ms. Liu.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I hope I heard it right. Are we saying for the secession, that's part, are we saying we keep the current existing language or the current proposed language?
The existing language.
The existing language, that means if Mr. Budish cannot work, Mr. Brady has to move. And I still want to state my objection, because this is like, this side of the roof is leaking, so you use those tiles to fix that, and that side is leaking. So I don't think that really solved the problem. I know for Board of Elections point of view, from that point of view, everybody only has a 56 days, sorry, 65 days, 300. So, but still, doing such a thing like that is not really a good for the whole structure. This actually already happened on the basic lower level. For example, in the shelter, they do the same thing. This is not done, so they put it that way. So actually, it becomes more problem. Do we want our county government to go on that route? Finally, we got something really wise. We have executive to do the administration work, and we have county council to watch out for from everybody's point of view. And they also equipped with chief of staff. Mr. Bucic has one too. Unfortunately, those two people are not elected. I'm talking about the chiefs of staffs, both of them. So maybe there's something else we should do, because putting two important positions, use one to remedy the other, I really don't think this is a good thing. If that actually happens, believe me, for all the accumulation of all the works county has not recovered yet, this is not a good idea. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I skipped past our own discussion, and I had several pieces of discussion that I wanted to put in front of you. The first of which is that I wanted to remind everybody that the final report, that's the final draft of the report that we want to send to council, is due on July the 1st. So to say that we're going to have to put the whip to the horse is probably an understatement. I'm going to work with Janae and with Michael and other members of staff to try to have some draft language for you to pick at. It's always been my feeling that it's better to have something to pick at than it is to try to say, okay, what are we going to do? So we'll try to pull some things together and put them in front of you and see what those look like, and let you come up with modifications, amendments, and adjustments. And we'll see how that goes for the things we've got. Because now we have three pieces. I think the only piece that really is left for us to decide has to do with the Inspector General's piece. And so we'll take that up in short order. There is, at this juncture, no need to consider minority reports, but there may be after that one. So we'll just have to see how that works out. And wanted to remind everybody that you do have the capacity to engage in a minority report. There is no requirement that we do everything by consensus. I'd like to do everything by consensus, but if that's not possible, then you have the ability to lay forward, why it is that you dissent. Once the final report is submitted to council, there are 2 additional meetings, I think, that are in front of council itself for us to kind of present and defend.
I think right now only one is scheduled, but my anticipation is that there will probably be at least 2 hearings held by council in committee between, I think the first one is going to be July, hold on, let me double check. 17th, thank you. July 17th is the first substantive hearing. It'll be introduced, all the amendments will be introduced for first reading on July 10th. But that's just going to be a first reading and referral to committee. The 17th is expected when the first substantive discussion will be. So it'll be at, it'll either be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is when it normally is, or hopefully 1 o'clock. We were looking to maybe move it up to provide a little more time for discussion amongst the members. But we'll send out a communication once that's finally scheduled. And obviously everyone is invited and will be provided an opportunity to provide public input, and I'm expecting Judge Adrian, assuming you're able to be there, that you can speak on behalf of the commission on specific topics.
July the 17th is...
If not, we can...
yeah, I know that I have to be in New Orleans that week, but I think the 17th is still going to be a good day.
Okay.
Yep, we're good.
Great.
Okay. Is there anything else for the good of the order? Yes.
The next meeting is June 6th. I will be in Columbus that day.
Okay. We've been having such a hard time scheduling things. If it's at all possible, Dennis, if you are able to call in, that would be fine.
Okay.
If not, we'll tell you what happens. Okay. Okay. Anything else?